Hi, greetings everyone. Thank you so much for joining me today. I promise I'm going to do my absolute best to be as succinct and straightforward as possible. I know everyone is super busy with work going on, getting ready for your trip to Washington, D.C. for the annual conference. But I suspect that to make the absolute most out of the Gear Up NZEP annual conference, that having a really good sense of how the Gear Up program works at the national level would really help you make the most of your time while you're interacting with your colleagues, learning about how different Gear Up programs go about their work, the different strategies they're employing, their different administrative structures, and so forth. So I'm hoping that this orientation can really jumpstart you and maximize your productivity while you're with us for about 3 days next week. My name is Alex Cho. I'm the Vice President for Government Relations at the National Council for Community and Education Partnerships. And I will definitely make sure that to get through the content and make sure that we reserve a little bit of time at the end if you have any questions. So I'll address that in just a moment. So before we get into what the GERA program is all about, I just wanted to take a quick minute and kind of explain who we are. The National Council for Community and Education Partnerships, or NCEP as we're known within the Beltway, we are a national not-for-profit organization. We are a national association of the state agencies, institutions of higher education, and school districts that lead Gear Up programs all over the country. And, bottom line, our mission is to help build the capacities of communities all over the country so that underserved students have just greater access to post-secondary opportunity. They're better prepared with the skills and knowledge required to succeed, and that we are continually catalyzing the pathway for low-income students from their education to college and career. So we do this through a number of different ways. Professional development, we put on 2 very large annual conferences a year, and we have a bunch of other kind of PD strategies that we work very closely with the Gear Up community on. We do a lot of technical assistance. We run a lot of national programs that we won't get into today, but I'm sure you'll learn a little bit about while you're in DC. We conduct a lot of research around what works in Gear Up and the efficacy of the program, and try to drive that to help inform decision makers and practitioners all over the country. And the domain where I have a lot of responsibility is as it pertains to public policy and advocacy. So one of our core functions as an association is to ensure that the White House, the Department of Education, and the U.S. Congress continue to be supportive of Gear Up and continue to make the necessary investments that make your work possible. So before I get into the actual content itself, given that there are, well over 100 people on this webinar, you may have discerned that everybody's on mute, just to keep the noise level down. But if you have any questions, there are a couple of different ways to do this. One, depending on if you're using the GoToWebinar desktop software or you're just viewing this online, the easiest way to ask a question is to type it in. So if you're on your desktop software, there's a little question box that you can type in your question. I will be immediately notified and will repeat that question and answer it to the best of my ability. And if you're online, you just click on that little squiggly question mark, and the same process will happen. And of course, I welcome anybody to speak up or on their experience with Gear Up. So if you want to chime in on this webinar, it's quite simple. You just if you look by your name, you can just kind of raise your hand, and I'll be notified, and I'll unmute you, and you can contribute to the conversation as well. Okay, so I suspect that many of you are either brand new to Gear Up or you're coming to the annual conference for the first time. And I just want to make sure that prior to your arrival that you have a really strong sense of the diversity of Gear Up programs. So let's start with the basics. What is this Gear Up that everyone is going to be talking about like crazy over the next couple of days? You'll hear the Gear Up phrase no less than probably 5,000 times over your next week or so. But Gear Up is a federal program, and the acronym stands for Gaining Early Awareness and Readiness for Undergraduate Programs. And in that acronym, as far as government acronyms go, it's a pretty good one. It kind of conveys all of the key concepts that we're going to dive into in a little bit more detail. But what you should know is that it is a highly competitive, federally funded initiative. And when I say it's highly competitive, the core takeaway that I want everybody to recognize right off the bat is that it is an incredible opportunity to even have the resources that Gear Up brings to your community, because less than 1 in 7 applicants were funded in the last competition. So if you can imagine, 6 out of those 7 applicants spent over a year doing a very robust planning process, and they weren't funded. The fact that you're part of the Gear Up family and part of the Gear Up community, the fact that you're doing this work, and we hope that you recognize what a blessing that is for your school, your families, the educators that are involved, and obviously your community at large. Gear Up is national in scope, so this is important, especially if you're relatively new to Gear Up. Although each and every Gear Up program has a very distinctive local flavor and is designed to meet the unique needs of your community. The program as a whole is all over the country. So Gear Up works everywhere. It works in the inner city, it works in rural communities, and I'll show you a little bit later kind of where you can find other Gear Up programs. So the key lesson there is that while, again, every program is unique, there's a lot of commonalities across Gear Up programs, so that we hope that when you're with us at the annual conference, that you really have a chance not only to network and meet some fantastic people, but that you have a real opportunity to share your expertise and that you can learn from the expertise of others, because we're all pursuing very, very similar goals. And relative to the national policy landscape, Gear Up is actually one of the very few programs that our federal government has created that is directly focused on improving the college and career readiness for low-income students. So, again, it is just an incredible opportunity for each of you to, really change the trajectory of our students and our families that you serve. It's in my 15 plus years working in the education community, I find the Gear Up community to be the most generous group of leaders that I've ever had the opportunity to meet and interact with. So we hope that you'll be enthusiastically join our community with a great deal of enthusiasm and contribute to this national movement. So let me before I get into how Gear Up works, let me just kind of spell out the core rationale for why Gear Up exists. As you can imagine, what we know is that there are tremendous disparities between high-income students and lower-income students when it pertains to not only a range of educational outcomes and indicators of college and career success, but that we also know that this gap is really, really persistent. So Gear Up was created in 1998, and it was a very, very radical idea at the time. But the problems that Gear Up are pursuing in terms of trying to identify solutions for at the local level, those problems have not gone away in the almost 20 years of Gear Up existence. So this is what we know. For the American public in general, and especially for our students, everybody seems to get the message that, if you want to be able to support a family after high school, if you want to be able to pursue a satisfying career, almost the vast majority of Americans say that it's really, really important that you have some type of post-secondary degree or credential beyond high school, right? So I think everybody gets the idea that it's not the 60s or 70s anymore, where having a high school diploma would be sufficient for earning the type of job or career that would allow you to support, for example, a family of 4. In fact, only 22% of Americans either agree or strongly agree that they're confident that only having a high school diploma can lead to a good job. And this belief is actually mirrored pretty deeply with our student population as well. I mean, and especially among low-income students. 96% of ACT tested low-income high school graduates have said that they aspire to earn some post-secondary degree or credential, and we think, despite the fact that college aspirations are really, really high, and everybody seems to get the message that higher education is really a passport to success, that there are some really, really important outcomes that need to be addressed as an education system as a whole. So let me start with the basics. I won't get into the nitty-gritty details here because, as education practitioners, you all see this firsthand. But, what we've seen over the very long history in American education is that we just see huge gaps as it pertains to academic readiness for higher education as it relates to family income. So what ACT has been able to document over the years is the percentage of their high school tested graduates who met three or more benchmarks that predict that students would do well in college credit bearing first year courses in higher education. And what you see are these huge, huge disparities between families in which the students come from that earn $100,000 or more. They seem to do quite well, whereas are the students in the lowest income bracket just don't have the same level of academic readiness. Now, there's a lot of reasons for that. We'll unpack that along the way. In addition to some gaps that we see around college readiness, what is perhaps a little bit more disconcerting is that we have some real gaps as it relates to college knowledge, right? So I'm going to define college knowledge is pretty broadly, right? But as each of you know from perhaps your own experiences or working with students, the journey to higher education is really, really complicated. A lot goes into the planning process. You have to make some very big and very difficult decisions. Financing higher education requires an entire level of content knowledge that just isn't discernible. And if you are the first in your family to go on to higher education, or you don't have a lot of caring adults in your circle that have been to higher education that can support you through that very difficult process, it's not a surprise that we see huge gaps between low income and high income students, right? So what we know is this. If you apply to two colleges instead of one college, for example, your odds of college enrollment increase by 40%. If you apply to three instead of two, you see that probability increase by an additional 10%. So there are some things about the college going process that there's a lot of evidence supporting that, making a better decision is quite achievable, but that we just have really big gaps. We know that students from higher income families are much more likely to apply to 4 or more colleges than students who are from lower income families who may just be applying to one college. And that that makes some contributions in terms of compounding some of the income-based gaps that we see. This is, really, really troubling insofar that it's not just limited to what a student may know. But what we know is that especially when it comes to things like financing higher education, which obviously is a huge determinant of, not only if a student is going to go on to higher education, but what type of institution that they go to, is that we see low-income students and low-income families in particular just really, really having a very incomplete picture about what financial aid opportunities are available for them, or how to finance higher education in a way that kind of best accommodates their unique needs. So what we know is that low-income students and their parents as well, they just don't have an accurate baseline for making good determinations about what college costs and how to finance higher education. And what we know is that without even the most basic college knowledge, parents overestimate the cost of higher education by about 228%. So, that is a huge myth that needs to be dismantled, with the student population that we care so deeply about. And Gear Up is going to play a big role in that for you all over the next couple of years. In the end, what I think the primary focus of the Gear Up program is about making a concerted national effort to really close the gap as it pertains to the number of low-income students who enroll into post-secondary education, be it a 2-year program, a 4-year program, or a high-quality post-secondary certificate program. Try to close the gap between the remarkably high rates of high-income students who enroll into higher ed and the disproportionately lagging numbers as it relates to low-income students. Now, what you can discern from this slide is that, while we've made progress in increasing the overall proportion of low-income students who enroll into higher education, I think the country has done a really nice job doing that. We still see these really, really stubborn and persistent gaps between low-income and high-income students. When you look at college completion, are students succeeding once they arrive on a college campus? I think this is where we start seeing those gaps, really exasperate themselves. If you look at the 6-year college completion rates by income, you'll see that high-income students are twice as likely to finish higher education or complete college within a 6-year window than low-income students. And even when you look at four-year institutions, we see this really, really stubborn gap between low-income students just not completing at the same rates that you see among their higher income peers. Now, the reason why this is so disconcerting to us, um, as a policy-centric organization, is because we think the one of the huge public policy benefits of higher education is helping to reverse or disrupt kind of intergenerational poverty, and we know that education, higher education in particular, is a primary way of doing that. Uh, this data is bared out over and over again, but we know that low-income students are 5 times more likely to get out of poverty if they earn a college degree. And so we think the long-term benefits of higher education, the return on an investment in higher education is a really, really sure bet, and it's a very powerful thing. So for us, it's not just about making sure that more low-income students are going to higher education, but it's also making sure that greater numbers of low-income students are succeeding once they get there. And when you look at college, bachelor's degree attainment, the numbers are quite stark. Students who are in the second or the bottom income quartile are just substantially less likely to actually earn a bachelor's degree by the age 24. And given everything we know about the future of the workforce, the future of our democracy, just the overall well-being of our society, we know that when you earn a post-secondary degree or credential, really good things happen to communities, states, and the country as a whole. So we see this as a tremendous opportunity for improvement and growth. So when I mentioned that Gear Up, was kind of a radical idea when it was created in 1998, there were a couple of elements that really stood out. I mean, typically most federal education programs are incredibly narrowly focused, meaning they try to solve one or two primary challenges. And what makes Gear Up really distinctive here is that the creators of the Gear Up program in the White House at the time under President Clinton, and also the many congressional champions, both Republican and Democrat, who created the Gear Up program. What was really interesting is they took a very, very comprehensive and holistic look at, well, how do you accelerate college readiness? How do you improve post-secondary outcomes? How do you do all of these things? What was distinctive was that they didn't just say, hey, we just need to have a better curriculum, or hey, we just need to have an after-school program. What they said is, we need to challenge communities to examine their own context in terms of their relative strengths, in terms of their relative weaknesses, to identify opportunities that would institute a unified approach to college readiness, in which some dimensions of the Gear Up program would focus exclusively on helping students improve their academic readiness and their academic achievement. Other activities associated with the Gear Up program would help students develop better academic or college and career aspirations for how they, the life that they're going to chart out for themselves for after high school. And then lastly, how do we incorporate a greater degree of college knowledge in our, not only among our student population, but among their families and among the broader community writ large. So one of the things that you'll notice about Gear Up, and you'll certainly hear a lot about at the conference, is, unlike a lot of other federal education programs, we talk about families explicitly. It is required by the law that the Gear Up program engage families so that we can help build a college-going culture that not only lives in our Gear Up schools, but start, blossoming in communities that have otherwise been underserved for decades, that we can start building a college-going culture that benefits all the students in the community. So the unified approach that has, been the hallmark of Gear Up, it really was a reflection of the research at the time, and it's certainly been reinforced by research since 1998 that says, if you want to really accelerate college and career readiness, it's not just about doing one thing really well. You have to do a lot of things really well, and that requires a very systemic approach to how we kind of tackle these challenges. So let me talk a little bit about, in practice, how Gear Up actually works, and what does it do to improve college and career readiness using that kind of framework that I just described. At the legislative level, the Gear Up program has three very broad national level objectives. So Congress every year they assess, is the program meeting these objectives? If so, let's continue to make investments in Gear Up. We've been fortunate that our community has responded quite well, and our students have been doing amazing, actually, given the limited resources that Gear Up provides. So the three objectives are broadly one, to increase the academic performance and preparation for post-secondary education for Gear Up students. Secondly, probably pretty obvious, but like increasing the high school graduation rate of participating Gear Up schools, and subsequently getting greater numbers of our Gear Up students to enroll directly into some form of post-secondary education as soon as they graduate. And then lastly is this notion of using Gear Up as a platform to elevate educational expectations for the students, among families and broader communities, especially as it pertains to what their post-secondary educational options are, how to prepare for higher education, and how to finance higher education without going to extreme levels of debt. So, have we succeeded? And the answer is pretty unequivocally yes. When we look at the most recent cohort of Gear Up students, in which we had a pretty sizable number of high school graduates, right? If you not, we don't have Gear Up grants expiring every year. We have typically like these really large waves of Gear Up students graduating from high school. That's why some of the data is a little older. But what we've seen is that the percentage of Gear Up's high school graduates who enroll immediately into college, our students have been doing really, really well. I mean, we've seen improvements since 2011. And our class of 2014, they enrolled into post-secondary education at a rate just over 77%, which compared to the national baseline of low-income students across the country that year of 45.5%, it's a pretty remarkable improvement. And certainly, if we were to see Gear Up success replicated in low-income schools all over the country, a lot of those issues that I just described, we'd have a very different outlook on on low-income students' prospects for post-secondary enrollment and success. So let me dive a little bit into how Gear Up gets this done. Now, I talked about the systemic nature of Gear Up, and really a lot of this ties back to the fact that the application process for Gear Up is just so darn competitive that leaders from K-12, leaders from higher education, and leaders from your broader community had to come together. They had to collect a lot of data, they had to analyze the data, and they really had to start to diagnose why aren't students or low-income students in our community pursuing higher education, and why aren't they succeeding in higher education? So if you can imagine like a massive data-driven SWOT analysis in which they were identifying specific barriers that were unique to their community, and then they said, hey, now that we know what those barriers are, we're going to design a set of activities and interventions to help us dismantle those barriers and strengthen the pathway to higher education. So typically this includes, from a kind of a shared perspective across the country, some of the common threads of Gear Up programs is that, Gear Up programs, first and foremost, they really start focusing students and their families on taking the most challenging courses that are available in their school. One of the mandatory programs or activities in Gear Up is you have to increase the number of low-income students who are completing a rigorous college prep curriculum. So that's a huge focus of Gear Up, and particularly in the middle schools and early high school experience. Gear Up and an overwhelming majority of the program's resources go to providing really intensive academic and social support to students. Let's certainly recognize that when a Gear Up student comes into our program at the 7th grade, it's not uncommon for them to be 1 or 2 years or more behind academically in, let's say, English language arts or mathematics. So we, a huge focus of Gear Up is getting them caught up, accelerating their academic development, and then also making sure that they're supported socially as well. I mean, we know that college readiness is not just purely about academics, so Gear Up can really flesh out a very comprehensive support network for our students. Engaging students and their families about why higher education is important, and I've talked about that quite a bit, so I won't belabor that point. And then what you will very often see, especially in the later stages of high school, is the Gear Up program really doing a lot of coaching and support, providing personalized attention to students and their families to help them make the best decisions possible as it relates to implementing the college search process, the very complicated college application process, and then getting them through post-secondary enrollment. So that will be a huge effort, I suspect, for most of your work, in the years to come. So some of the things that make Gear Up unique, this is kind of a high-level flyover, but Gear Up is really very distinctive in the sense that it is very holistic, as I mentioned, but it's fundamentally rooted in early intervention. So each and every Gear Up program, with the exception of a handful of state Gear Up grants that have a different implementation model, the vast majority of our Gear Up programs begin no later than the 7th grade. So we start talking about college access and readiness and college success. We're not waiting until students are juniors or seniors in high school, but we're starting that primary point of emphasis in the 7th grade, because what we know from the research is that a student's aspirations become remarkably firm by the time that they've enrolled in the 8th grade. So our hope is that with Gear Up that we have an opportunity to really engage and educate students and families early. Gear Up provides whole grade levels of students with sustained programs. So typically, most Gear Up programs implement what's known as the cohort approach. So the Gear Up program is not actually linked to any individual school per se. It's actually linked to that 7th grade class of students. So the Gear Up program will serve that entire grade level of 7th grade students in low-income schools, and they will follow those students as they go from the 7th and 8th grade, matriculate into high school, follow those students through early to late high school, and then often into the first year of post-secondary education. So as our students mature and progress through the education continuum, the Gear Up program follows them. So it's very different than, let's say, like a whole school model that you see in other federal education programs, and it's very different from, let's say, other programs where you select, okay, if I have 100 7th graders, I'm going to serve, these 25 out of 100. That's not how Gear Up works. You have to serve the entire grade level. Gear Up is, again, since the competition is so demanding, each and every Gear Up applicant is really expected to demonstrate that they have applied really rigorous research-based practices about what works, that they've applied it to the very unique needs of their local context. So it requires a lot of analysis, and it requires a lot of data collection, not only leading up to the grant, but while you're implementing the grant. And there's a lot of reporting requirements, right? So each of our Gear Up programs, they have to provide a pretty comprehensive report to the U.S. Department of Education every year to secure their next year's funding. So chances are you're going to be asked to collect and to document a lot of data, your interactions with students, families, other educators. And it's not just because your Gear Up program leaders are committed to some form of continuous improvement, but they're also obligated to as a condition of receiving the grant. So there are some strings attached, and data collection is one of them. Gear Up, one of the really brilliant things that the Gear Up legislation did in 1998 is it kind of recognized that college access and readiness, it wasn't just a K-12 problem, right? It wasn't just a matter of our middle schools and high schools not doing enough, but that if we were to ever find a solution to really substantially increasing the number of low-income students, that we'd need a lot of entities and communities to work together towards achieving very comprehensive systemic goals, not as a K-12, not as a higher education, and not as communities, entities working separately, but all of them working together. So each and every Gear Up program is actually comprised of these really comprehensive community and education partnerships. And as part of that, the Gear Up program by statute requires that for every dollar that you receive of federal money through the Gear Up program, that your community has to match it with one non-federal dollar. So that dollar for dollar match requirement is statutorily required. The law requires it. It's a condition of receiving the grant. So if your GERA program receives, just by means of example, $2 million a year from the federal government, your GERA program has to demonstrate that they've either raised $2 million in cash from, the state or your community, or more commonly through in-kind contributions, so people volunteering their time, spaces, services, etc. So one of the big administrative challenges of Gear Up is related to the match. I'm sure all of you have been asked to think about, or to document, match, and just know that that is a federal requirement. It wasn't the idea per se of let's say your Gear Up leadership. It wasn't something that they're just looking to do. It is a condition of receiving an award. If your community does not demonstrate that they're making substantial progress for meeting that dollar for dollar match requirement, your program would potentially be at risk for not receiving, the full allocation the following year. So it's very, very important that all of us do our part as it relates to the Gear Up match. And then when you look at how our Gear Up programs define success, there are a handful of performance objectives that are common across virtually all of our Gear Up programs. So these are essentially prescribed by the U.S. Department of Education, and every applicant to the Gear Up program has to address these objectives either formally as part of their evaluation plan, or they could be a subset of metrics that they're reporting on. But these are related to, a handful of, they're obvious. I won't go into detail, but they're tightly related to successfully completing core gateway courses in English language arts, mathematics, etc., being on track to apply for college by, sitting for the SAT or ACT, obviously reporting on the percentage of Gear Up students who complete high school successfully, the percentage of students who complete the FAFSA, the number of and percentage of Gear Up students who enroll into post-secondary education, and then the percentage of students who are placing into college level math and English without remediation, and then the percentage of students who during their first year of post-secondary education are on track to return for their second year and therefore are on track to graduate college. So while you're at the conference, chances are you're going to see a ton of conversation about one or more of these objectives, and probably the vast majority of the concurrent sessions that you're going to be part of. So just know that again, while this is a common ground that all of us face, these indicators were really evolutionary and were developed by the U.S. Department of Education. Okay, so let's get into some of the common activities that you see in Gear Up programs across the country. Now, as a reminder, I talked about how at the time of application, each Gear Up program has to do a very, very thorough and rigorous kind of self-assessment to identify activities and interventions that meet their unique needs. While that is absolutely true, we also know that just from the broader research literature, and especially just from our experience working with low-income schools and low-income communities, we actually do see a set of activities that are really common against Gear Up programs. So I suspect that the vast majority of the concurrent sessions that you're going to attend at the annual conference will probably address one or more of these types of activities. So going back to that kind of unifying framework around the academics, what I'm trying to represent with this slide is that when you think about the continuum, the 7-year duration of the Gear Up program, we start serving students in the middle schools, and then we follow them through early and late high school and into the first year of post-secondary education. There are some common programs that span that entire duration from middle school to post-secondary. So programs like tutoring, advising, and mentoring, professional development, curriculum alignment and development, just strengthening the overall academic offerings at a school. So, for example, bringing advanced placement, bringing IB, bringing new curriculum and new technologies into schools, and then summer programming is a huge point of emphasis for Gear Up, given everything we know about the what the research says about summer melt. Those types of activities tend to span the entire 7-year grant. So, for example, the type of tutoring and mentoring that really the only thing that changes from the middle grades to the post-secondary level, it's not that they continue to offer mentoring and tutoring, each of those 7 years, but just the underlying nature of the content changes, and perhaps their tutoring strategy evolves as students become a bit more mature. But there are some very episodic type activities that we see in each of our Gear Up programs. So, for example, in the early years of a Gear Up grant, when students are in middle school or early high school, you see a huge point of emphasis about getting students and families to commit to taking the right courses that get them ready for higher education. Obviously, those are big choices that students and families need to make. So, making sure that they understand the implications and the benefits of taking the most challenging curriculum available is really, really important. Most Gear Up programs see the middle school to high school transition as being a key transition that we need each of our students to succeed with. So we see a lot of bridge programs as students go from middle school to high school. There's a, I'd say over the last 6 or 7 years, a huge point of emphasis in Gear Up, especially around dual and concurrent enrollment in post-secondary. So it's a fantastic trend that we're seeing where Gear Up students are graduating high school either with a pretty impressive number of college credits under their belt, or in a lot of cases, actual associate's degrees having been earned by the time that they've completed high school. Again, we see a lot around advanced placement, IB, and to a lesser extent, Gear Up helping to create early college high schools. Typically we see a lot of activity around helping students prepare for the SAT and ACT, not just at that junior year, but some of the early antecedents of those assessments. And then we also, Gear Up, not a shocker, but just because students apply to a college and tell you that they're going to enroll doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to enroll. We know from the research that a lot can happen that summer. So we see a lot of high school to post-secondary bridge programs to really make sure that students have all of the knowledge and resources that they need to make sure that transition to higher education is as smooth as possible. On the aspirational side, we see a ton of work around student, family, and community engagement. Again, typically around college knowledge and emphasizing the value of higher education. We see a lot of work around career counseling, mentoring, and internships, helping to stimulate this idea that the journey to a career, post-secondary education is a critical step in that journey, but it's not the only step, right? Helping students define what their long-term interests are, helping them align them to career fields and so forth, ultimately has a really positive impact on how they select majors and which institutions they're going to go to. So that type of advisory is hugely important. There are a couple of other places that are really, really super interesting, right? So a lot of our Gear Up programs are really starting to emphasize I shouldn't say it as if it's a recent thing, but we're just seeing greater numbers of Gear Up programs really focusing on developing student leadership. And they do this through, going a step beyond just offering, let's say, motivational programs, but creating real opportunities for students to discover their leadership skills and their talents and help them develop their voice. All of these things, they put them to use in terms of service learning context. And they're doing this so that they can really start creating a culture in their schools in which, a commitment to leadership, a commitment to learning, a commitment to education can start to be socialized in a positive way, maybe not necessarily as a negative. A lot of investments in Gear Up around helping to develop non-cognitive behaviors in students, right? So all of the non-academic supports around grit and determination, social capital, navigating, complex networks and so forth. And then in a more episodic way, what's so interesting about talking to former Gear Up students or alumni of the Gear Up program is when you ask them, like, what was Gear Up to you, or what was your favorite part of Gear Up? generally, it's pretty remarkable how often you hear that it was when Gear Up took them to a college campus, um, in middle school, and really showed them in a very hands-on kind of first-person way that they belong there. And for many of our students, this is not only their first opportunity to kind of get out of their neighborhood per se, but it really does make such a deep impression to show students that not only do they, you know, should they be thinking that college is possible, but that they actually are welcome there and that they would thrive on a college campus. To me, that is one of the kind of the best thing about talking to our alumni is you get to hear how important that experience was to them setting higher aspirations and making deeper commitments to their own education. And then on the aspirational side, obviously helping students access scholarships, tuition discounts, or tuition waivers, or giving them some stipends and awards is a big point of emphasis in a lot of different GERA programs. And then lastly, around college knowledge, you'll see, boy, the work that Europe is doing around college knowledge is so incredibly innovative, and having seen the abstracts of the different sessions that are going to be offered at this annual conference, I'm so excited to learn about what schools are doing. So we're seeing a real transition from thinking about, okay, well, how do we just advise individual students and how do we advise individual families, to how do we start building greater capacity, not only in our schools, but entire communities around building a college going culture? And then how do we start to really build a culture of financial literacy so that students and families not only have a good understanding of what it's going to take to finance their higher education, but start building, start acquiring the knowledge and building the habits necessary to have the financial resources to get there. So a lot of really interesting stuff here. Obviously, there's a lot of teaching during the middle school and early high school, right? Just a lot of educating students and families. As we start transitioning towards later high school, we see just a transition from teaching to much more direct, personalized, hands-on support around college search, application, and enrollment. And then something that each and every one of our Gear Up programs and each of our Gear Up schools will be doing is a massive FAFSA completion push. That's such a powerful predictor. Our students are going to go on, and helping students finance their education is obviously, one of the core tenets of Gear Up. So that's kind of how Gear Up works in a nutshell. I mean, I've grossly oversimplified things just for time's sake, but when you do come to the annual conference, I just want you to be aware that although your role in the Gear Up program may be related to one of those individual strategies, for example, let's say you're, an academic tutor and you're working with a cohort of students to get them ready, in a given subject, that there are all of these related supports happening with the ultimate goal that the nexus of those strategies would come together to strengthen the pathway to college. And as important as those strategies are, I mean, the reality is that, our success in Gear Up, really comes down to some pretty basic concepts, right? Gear Up is about people, it's about leadership, and it's about relationships, right? So having identified really talented people to work for Gear Up in communities is probably the most important thing a Gear Up program can do to ensure its own success. Get the right people in front of students and families, and you will see progress. Gear Up is about owning our leadership role, right? So recognizing that college access and readiness isn't any one individual's problem necessarily to solve. The one thing that you will find in the Gear Up community is that we have all taken a very deep and personal ownership in ensuring that our students are succeeding, and you couldn't quantify the value of that. It's the most powerful thing we have. And then Gear Up is about relationships, not just between a Gear Up professional and their students or their families that they're working with, but forging stronger relationships within schools, forging stronger relationships between schools, and forging stronger relationships between the K-12 and the higher education system. If we do these three things right, we can see some extraordinary outcomes. All right, so let me just very quickly talk a little bit about how, some of the basics, some of the technical aspects of Gear Up, just so that you have a good understanding when you get to the conference. So the way that the Gear Up program, like you may be wondering, well, how did we ended up getting identified as a Gear Up community or as a Gear Up school? So this is kind of how it works. Again, oversimplifying here, but what happens is that the U.S. Congress determines every year they determine a total Gear Up allocation, right? So in 2018, they allocated $350 million for the Gear Up program, and they sent that money to the U.S. Department of Education. From there, the Department of Education either hosts a grant competition to make new awards. And again, those are super competitive. They make awards based on based on a formal peer review process, and then the U.S. Department of Education provides a lot of oversight and accountability. So every Gear Up program, not only do you have to win the award at the time that you apply, but you essentially have to win the award every year. You have to demonstrate that you're making progress towards meeting your goals in order to secure your next year's funding. The Gear Up Fiscal Agent is a terrible phrase. I apologize, but that's what the legislation calls them. This is the state agency, the institution of higher education, or the school district that actually designed the Gear Up program, applied for the grant, and manages the overall resources that the Gear Up program receives. So hopefully you're all know who your Gear Up director is, but they typically provide high level leadership and oversight to the very complicated implementation of the Gear Up program. And then they also work very closely with the schools, right? They're providing capacity building, technical support, partnership management, professional development, you name it. And then where the rubber hits the road is the schools, right? So the schools that partner with Gear Up, they typically get a subset of the overall Gear Up award. They submit an annual budget. They receive an annual budget to implement programs, and so that's where we're meeting our students, the platform we have to engage with our families. But then in addition, they are, in addition to running the programs and making sure that we're serving students and families and educators well, they're also collecting a lot of data, right? So they're getting information about students, schools, district data, and reporting that back up to the Gear Up Fiscal Agent, who then in turn provides an annual report to the Department of Ed. One important thing to note about the Gear Up program is, although we talk about Gear Up as a single entity, there really are two similar but distinctive grant types that are funded under Gear Up. One goes to states, right? Meaning, every state can only have one Gear Up grant, and the organization that leads that award, is an organization that was appointed by the governor of that state. States also have an additional expectation to either provide scholarships to Gear Up students or to obtain a waiver from the U.S. Department of Education. And then outside of that, they implement a series of activities to accelerate college and career readiness, very similarly to how partnership grants work. But state grants, they tend to be a little larger, right? So their annual budgets, they're limited in the last couple of rounds of new awards. They were limited to $3.5 million for each of their 6 or 7 years. Although in the competition that's due on Friday, that has been increased to $5 million. Now, partnership grants, which comprise the majority of our Gear Up community, they are super competitive 6 or 7 year grants. And when I say super competitive, I mean, as you can imagine, there's only so many states to compete for a state grant, whereas on the partnership side, there are literally thousands of communities that can be applying. These are 6 or 7 year grants. They are awarded to a school district or an institution of higher education. They provide the services that I described a little earlier, and they focus exclusively on really, really specific feeder patterns in their communities. And unlike the states, which are limited on an annual budget, the size of a partnership grant really depends on how many students they elect to serve. So we have some programs that receive less than $500,000 a year annually, and our largest single partnership grant receives upwards of $7 million for each of the 7 years. That's because they serve, as you can imagine, a huge number of students. So while the annual budget is limited to about $800 per student, the actual average is much closer to $500. So if you can imagine, achieving the types of outcomes that I described earlier in this webinar at the very low cost or the very low investment of about $500 per student per year is a pretty remarkable return on investment. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about the size and scope of Gear Up. So we have in 2018, 154 Gear Up grants, 45 of which are those state grants, and we serve about just a little bit over 707,000 students across the country. As you'll see, the average state grant award is about 3.3 million, whereas the average partnership grant is about 1.6 million. But the variation on those partnership grants are pretty substantial. And with apologies to our colleagues from Hawaii and Alaska, I just couldn't fit you on my map here. Here's where you see the fiscal agents of GURA programs, right? So what isn't very clear is like you'll see a lot of overlapping dots. Like so for example, if you look at New York City or Chicago or Los Angeles, we have multiple GURA programs operating in those districts or those cities. But one of the major takeaways is that GURA is basically everywhere. I mean, there's only a handful of states that don't have any Gear Up activity at all. And through these 154 Gear Up programs, we serve approximately 3,800 middle and high schools, in every type of community imaginable, from the rural, mountains of northern New Mexico to, let's say the Bronx in New York. And because Gear Up is flexible enough to really accommodate the unique needs of local communities, it can thrive in communities all over the place. Okay, so with that said, I am just right on time relative to making sure that if we have any questions, that we can open up a line of dialogue around that. So if you have any questions about the GEAR Up program at the national level, if you have any questions about, the upcoming conference, or anything that you could possibly imagine, feel free to fire away. So I'll give everybody a minute to do that. And in the event that we don't get any questions, I will just reward you for your time and attention by giving you a couple minutes back. Okay, so far, no questions. So that either means that I've done a really, really good job, or I've done a really, really poor job. I'm feeling optimistic today, so maybe I'll lean towards the former. But let me point out a couple of things. One, if you do have any questions, hey, just had a couple of questions come in, so let me address those very quickly. One, how do you suggest choosing sessions to attend at the conference? Oh, that's a tough one, Kim. If you haven't done so already, you need to download the conference app. And also, if you go to the NCEP website, you can download a PDF that has all of the sessions that are available, and with a really very clear, succinct abstract of each of the sessions. I would bring that with you on your flight, and I would review them. And what's so great about the sessions is, we have something like 130 plus concurrent sessions going on. We have something for everybody at every opportunity. So there's just a lot of great sessions. Unfortunately, the best way to choose it is just to go through, identify the ones that really speak to your role and what you'd like to learn as a professional in terms of your development, and select those. I'd also talk to your team. So a lot of our GEAR Up programs, before they get to the conference, they'll kind of say, hey, given what we are going, given what we're going to be doing over the next academic year, let's split up our team. Let's cover all of these different sessions so that we can come back and debrief on really important things that we've learned. So good luck with that. But yes, the conference app is now available to download, and or you can go to the NCEP website. It's edpartnerships.org, navigate to the 2018 annual conference, and you can download a PDF of the session descriptions, and that'll help you. Okay, will the webinar be available in the archives? Yes, so I've recorded this webinar, so you can access it anytime. It'll be on our YouTube page. We're going to post it to the quad, and then I'm going to be sending it out to all the GEAR Up directors in tomorrow's NCEP Weekly Digest. And I'll make sure that if you are interested, that I'll send an email out to everybody so you can get that link as well. And I should also note that I've uploaded the slide deck under the handout section of the GoToWebinar system. So if you're interested in having a copy of the presentation, or if you just want to take the presentation and share it with colleagues, you can just go ahead and download that. And then, of course, if you have any other questions, like I said, we are an association and Giro program, so we are literally here, for one purpose, and that is to make sure that you feel supported and you're doing, you're in a position to succeed. So if I can personally, be of any assistance to you, if you have any specific questions that I can't, that we didn't get to, email me anytime. Come up to me at the conference. I'm usually lingering around. Look forward to meeting you all, and hope you have a safe travels to DC. And thank you all so much for your time and attention. Have a great day. Thanks.